Whoever drinks beer, he is quick to sleep. Whoever sleeps long does not sin. Whoever does not sin enters heaven. Thus, let us drink beer.
Welcome back to the Go to Hell podcast. Strong opinions, weekly held about Christianity, the church, and beer. Let's join our hosts, Tim Curley and Colton Pierce, as they continue to discuss Book 3 of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis.
Beer number 2, we're drinking a BarrelHouse Brewing Company's in celebration of the Mario Brothers movie that's out right now. We are drinking the Kong IPA, which has Hazy IPA. We're drinking Hazy's tonight, which has the Mario Brothers theme on the can with Donkey Kong throwing hops instead of barrels down upon Mario. So
I always wonder, because I don't mean to get BarrelHouse in trouble, but I always wonder when small breweries like this do this kind of stuff, are they just flaunting the intellectual property laws and like the hell with it, or?
Yeah, no shot Nintendo would let this fly if they knew about it.
Well, they would, but BarrelHouse couldn't pay the licensing fee to do it. So, I mean, go ahead, I don't care, but main thing is it's pretty tasty.
Yeah.
And I will say, no disrespect, BarrelHouse, because we're always so cheery about everybody we're always drinking here. I will say, BarrelHouse, some of the stuff you make, I'm not a fan of, but that's just me and my flavor profile. But they are very popular here in the Central Valley and on the Central Coast. We have a big tap room in Visalia, and it is packed pretty much every night of the week. So, props to them.
Yeah, BarrelHouse.
They make a lot of different beers.
They make a lot of different beers. I think just what's hard is they have such a huge following, such a huge tap room. And it's just like, there's better beer around. So. Well,
yeah, I mean, they're jack of all trades, master of none. And that's not a knock. It's just, I can find better IPAs than what they make, but they make some decent. They make one or two IPAs that don't take care for, but they do make some good IPAs. But there is something to be said about a brew company that is more concerned about being jack of all trades, master of none, because anybody can walk in, then there's a beer they like.
Right, and that's the hard part about. Well, I feel that way about another brewery, but it's a brewery that hits a little bit closer to home for Tim, so I won't say anything. Tim's a big fan of this brewery, so I didn't want to say anything.
You can say it.
I feel the same way about Sierra Nevada.
Well, but they don't do. But you can say they don't nail everything they do, but they don't do like all kinds of different beer. They just do all kinds of variants of IPAs.
I'm not putting it like on the same level as
no.
I'm just more saying that like where it's like there's not a beer that like stands out to me where I'm like, ooh, I'd like. Okay, so like for example, and this is a terrible. Well, no, I don't feel like it's a terrible example, but I mean like when I think of Russian River, I'm like, I want a Pliny the Elder. I mean, obviously younger, but I mean like what I can get, I'm like, yeah, that's what I want. When I think of Ballast Point, I want a Sculpin. When I think of Lagunitas, I want a little something where I want an IPA. When I think of, some of these breweries, this is what I want. When I think of Sierra Nevada, I'm like, sure I could have a Toledo. Sure I could have a...
Yeah. No,
it's not like a bad thing.
No.
Like, but it's just like...
Look, there's nothing...
When I think of Firestone, I want...
They don't need us defending them. They have 3 breweries.
Yeah, they're like, we know what we're doing, you jackasses. And I'm just like...
We have a massive plant in Chico. We have a massive plant in Ashland, North Carolina. They're on both coasts, even though they're quote unquote a West Coast microbrewery, so they know what the hell they're doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I agree with you. It's just like, hey, it's not like I need to go to the liquor store or the convenience store around the corner because I'm really craving a Toledo.
Yeah, maybe it just has to do with the level of accessibility of it with the...
Sure, because I kind of feel that way a lot of times about Lagunitas. It's like,
Yeah, I mean, that's how I used to feel, and now I'm like, okay, I'll get a little 7-12 pack every time I go, like, you know, because it's not there anymore all the time. So, I mean, like, I agree with your statement about how, like, they dive into, they have so many.
So Sierra Nevada's got every kind of, they have every kind of lager and IPA that you can think of. And then every once in a while they'll delve into something outside of that. The thing that we're talking about with BarrelHouse, which is headquartered in Paso Robles, California,
Yep.
but they have tap rooms in a couple other cities, is they hit everything. They've got sours, they've got stouts, they've got
seltzers.
They've got a Michelada. They have a Michelada they sell. They have, you can, again, like I said, if you got friends who are like, I'm not really that into beer, they're more like a Bud or Coors or Michelob. They can go there and find a beer they're perfectly comfortable with and go like, oh, this is actually really good. But it's within their like tamer flavor profile.
Right. And something that I will say about them is their atmosphere is phenomenal.
Oh, the atmosphere at the tap room, both there and in Paso.
And in Fresno, if you go to the Fresno one.
Yeah, is amazing.
Is awesome. Highly recommend if you're ever in Paso Robles, Fresno. Or...
They're the Starbucks of beer. They've like it's as much showing up to the place as it is anything else.
Yeah, it's really awesome, and you get to have. And again, their beer is good. You'll drink it, and you'll be like, "This is great. I'm here with friends," and like that whole experience is what makes it. You'll be excited to have it and drink it. It is really good. If you want to take it a step above that, where we're talking about where they do a lot of that stuff, but then they take that beer up to the next level. We say them all the time.
Yeah.
But if you are ever in Turlock, California,
Dust Bowl.
is Dust Bowl, where you have that very similar atmosphere, but now the beer is just like escalated a bit. They also have phenomenal food there as well. So it's like, golly, you guys took what BarrelHouse was doing, and you guys were like, we could do this better. And you did.
But if you are in Paso Robles, you're Central Coast wine country sometime, you like beer.
Yeah, and you're like, I don't really care for wine.
Definitely hit up Firestone, and then right around the corner, hit up BarrelHouse.
Yeah, hit them both up. Absolutely. I'd highly recommend it.
BarrelHouse is much more laid back. It's just a big tap room. There's usually 2 or 3 food trucks there, so you can get food from 3 completely different food trucks. Or you can go to Firestone, which is...
and they have
right
great food.
They have a great food. They have the tap room.
Fish tacos all the way at Firestone.
Yeah. So, anyway, shout out to Paso. Skip the wine, hit the beer.
Well, I was like, Paso's wine is on the up and up. In my opinion, I was like, everybody in California or everybody outside of California is so hot and heavy for. North Coast.
It's always been Napa.
It's
Napa
always
wines.
a Napa versus Sonoma, you know.
Yeah.
And then, but really, Central Coast, Paso is they've got some really good wine selection over there. So
they do absolutely. Okay, let's get back on
random
track.
commercial break.
Yeah. This segment was brought to you by BarrelHouse Brewing Company. Okay.
I was gonna say.
Okay.
It's okay.
Okay. This did raise a question with me. I'm going to raise it, and then we'll make this a hot topic or clean up on aisle 5 on the next episode.
Sure. Because
his whole
getting my
discussion
natural
about
response from this right now, and
what?
then I said because you're getting my natural response from this right now, and then we're gonna be like, hey, we're gonna have to clean that up next week.
I don't know that we want to turn this into too long of an episode. I mean, I don't know if your answer is not too long, or you just think it's a crackpot theory. We'll just see. Maybe we'll just turn this into a side. Anyway, I was reading this part where he's talking about money and charity, et cetera, and politics.
Yes.
And it just dawned on me. We've talked about it on this podcast. We talked about it at the beginning, why people are leaving the church. We've given all these kinds of different reasons, yada, yada, yada. We've never brought up the reason of just maybe we're just too damn wealthy in the United States, in the West, and religion and a faith with a God. We are the rich person Jesus has talked about. And it's just like, I don't need God. I got everything I need. Oh, and when I say everything I need, I mean we have everything we think we need.
No, I got you.
I'm not saying that's the main reason. I don't think there's one reason why the church has declined. I'm saying this is, I think, one reason that we don't talk about of maybe we just got too wealthy and you could maybe call it lazy. We don't have much hardship. The things we whine about and complain about in particularly the United States are things of our own doing.
Yeah, I think what is the term? The old saying, God whispers in our victories and he shouts in our defeats.
Yeah, I mean, there was a riot over the weekend in Chicago, and people were saying it's because these kids are poor, and they're out there. There's people holding cell phones, recording people also recording cell phones, rioting over lack of food. And I don't know why there was a riot in Chicago. I don't really care, but the point is just it's even though it wasn't a bunch of white people rioting in Chicago, it's like, yeah, it's what was we were saying a lot in the 2000s and the 10s of it's white rich people problems compared to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
We have people who do go to bed hungry at night, but not that many. Our problem is obesity.
Yeah, I think I think when we get back to these cardinal traits or whatever we called them earlier, I keep wanting to say traits of temperance, fortitude, justice, and what was our first one?
It
wasn't countenance, was it? It was
no, it was where did they go? Prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude.
Yeah, it's prudence.
Dear prudence.
And we look at the nation as a whole. I don't think that it's wrong to sit there and say that we have established ourselves as our own gods, or some other god has taken over. Be it knowledge, be it whatever, and that we come from a spot of luxury where we can sit there and say, like, there's nothing wrong, and so therefore, yeah, I think people often, and if you look in ancient civilizations, it's easy to sit there and say you only look for God in hardship, and maybe for some Christians that are listening to this podcast, that may be some of you,
right?
Where we look for God in the times that we feel closest to God are actually at our worst. That's when we communicate. That's when we pray. That is when we tap into that spiritual senses where we are sitting there and we are feeling we are at rock bottom. And so that's when we reach out. That's why a lot of those testimonies that you hear that are super powerful is about these people that are at death's door or they're at rock bottom and somehow they're able to spring back. But actually, believe it or not, they are more receptive to God in those moments than they have ever been before. And what Tim is suggesting is that because of the financial circumstances, because of the rights that are being given in this country, and because of whatever, we are less receptive to who God is. And believe it or not, very similar to Israel.
Yeah.
In the scriptures, where it was, they could sit there, at least based off of the way that the story is told, which is a good part to emphasize, is that when things were going good, Israel did not need God, right? That's the hard part of God continuously showed himself over and over again to these people, right? Like that's That's the funny part about like Moses in the desert, right? Everybody watched. Everybody that was a part of the Exodus witnessed the miracles of God
Yeah.
and what Moses was preaching that they did.
And then we're like,
Went up on a fucking mountain for like, now don't get me wrong, Moses was up there a while and there's like the storm and all that shit. Like literally there's like this storm cloud that's just hovering around Zion and there's lightning and all this shit. We were like, he died. What do we do? I guess we build a golden calf and we worship that shit.
You're leaving out. We're wandering around the desert where there's nothing to eat or drink, and manna is provided every day. And after a while, like, oy vey, manna again.
Let's get a golden cow out here. Let's melt all of our jewelry down and let's make a cow. Aaron, make it happen, man. And so you and it's like these are people that have witnessed that shit and they're actually struggling, right? And they're like, this is better. And Moses comes back down and gets so pissed that he breaks the 10 Commandments. Or not the 10 Commandments, but the tablets, and has to go back up and get them rewritten. He's so pissed. But yeah, no, that's similar. Once you actually get into Israel and you see all these things that happen, and again, this life of luxury. I mean, you could make the claim about lots of different people in the scriptures about whether or not they would have struggled as bad as they struggled if they didn't come from a place of luxury and kind of understanding that. So I don't think that it's far-fetched to sit there and say
no. I think the counter, and it's a recent counter, we just started talking about it this past Sunday in our church, is we're now in a mental health crisis. I think a lot of times we overstate. We're kind of in a continual state of crises and mass psychosis in the country. We're always kind of looking for the latest mass psychosis or crisis to go from, whether it be this country to invade or this country's threatening our security or what, yada yada yada. But I do, it's clear we are mentally and emotionally broken. I don't think the statistics on our mental health are if they're out of whack, they're not far out of whack.
Yeah, but
and so maybe this is because we're now reaching peak of people turning away from God because we've been too rich, and now we're starting to make a turn towards. Yeah, I'm starting to realize there's more than DoorDash, my phone, and whatever's on Netflix at night.
I think so. My argument, and listen, I'm somebody who is a huge advocate for mental health. As somebody who goes through mental health issues, which I think we've discussed on this podcast. We've discussed that on the podcast.
We've discussed it twice over. Yeah, we haven't done a full episode on, but we've hit it twice. We've hit it from both trauma and just chemical imbalance.
Yeah, as somebody who has struggled with that and still continues to struggle with that, it is a constant battle. For those of you, again, that have experienced it know that. I do think that and my philosophy is not necessarily backed. I think there is backing behind it. It's just, it may not be the leading trend and it may not be what people want to hear. But there's this idea that was originally pitched in development to where we're talking about a hierarchy of needs. Hierarchy of needs is simply like you are concerned with when you are talking about what you need first, and then you are able to move on to being concerned with other things. So what is my first and utmost priority, and then what is my priority after that? What is my priority after that? So for starters, the base level of the priority of needs is that you need water, air, you need shelter, you need food. That's the baseline. And as it continues to go up from there, you become more. You eventually get to reach what is called self-actualization, to which that is where you are completely content with all of your surroundings and all of those problems. Now, what they're finding is that if they do more research, and they're finding that people in third world countries that have significantly more things to be stressed out about and more worried about are not having nearly the same amount of problems as Americans are, or westernized culture is having with these issues of anxiety and depression. And I don't feel like those stats are really acknowledging the fact that there is a hierarchy of needs, because really what I think that is happening is that when we get to that level, what we are struggling with is, before we are able to reach self-actualization, is that there's a level of social needs. And we are so concerned in that social needs aspect that we are like, okay, is this right? Is this right? Is this right? Based off of socially, because when you find out about anxiety and depression, you're going to find that a lot of those things are based around social pressures and social needs. And so therefore, am I good enough? Am I smart enough? That's the problem with Instagram. That's the problem with all social media. If you look at CNN and whether or not you're intaking too much information, again, those are deals with social aspects, and you have to have your social needs met in order to reach self-actualization. And so because we have all of these needs met before us in the United States or in westernized culture, then there is a lot of things that are going to go wrong in that social category, and that's our biggest problem that we face. It's not any less of a problem necessarily. It doesn't make it more difficult, or it doesn't mean that it's any less difficult than some of the other ones that are going on. If anything, this is something that is uncharted territory, because for long periods of time, people were still focusing and struggling in other tier levels of our hierarchy of needs. And so for all of us to be sitting here and being able to wrestle with social issues and what's going on in our brains is actually really awesome that we don't have that kind of stuff going on, the basic tier levels. But it's something that is concerning, and where a lot of people are finding themselves in valleys, and when I say valleys, is just low points in their life where they don't see any way out of. Because again, this is where something that needs to be said about it is, if you sit there and you look at the social hierarchy of needs, or you look at the hierarchy of needs and you look further down, all of that stuff is physical. It's very physical. Okay, I need a family. I need people around me, blah, 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 blah. That's it. But socially, it is all mental. And especially as we're trying to, as more research is coming out about introverts and extroverts and how we respond to one another, how we get met socially is different for every single person. Whereas I know what people need for a shelter and what they need for food and oxygen, and all that kind of stuff. And so it is not something that's physical, it's something that's mental. And so it can be extremely challenging. So sorry if you paid attention to all of that. That's basically what I'm getting at, is that mental illness is a very legitimate thing, and I think that it is something that causes these valleys and stuff, and it's not something that can just go away. It's something that's better off than some of these other things. But
I think that was a really nice little side cul-de-sac. So we've settled it. Yes, we are too wealthy and decided we don't need God until about now. And now we've created a whole bunch of new problems in the last 15, 20 years that have now fully matured into problems that probably need God's assistance in its way out. So,
yeah.
Okay, so wrapping up this chapter, This has been a long one. I understand that, but this is important and it's very practical. He then basically wraps up this chapter. Remember, he's laid out, here's frankly what Christianity will look at like politically, if you're voting economically, socioeconomically, etc., etc. He then ends by saying, the point of all this isn't to tell you how to vote. But the point is, and this has been a theme of the podcast, your Christianity should not conform to your politics, but should actually inform your politics.
Yes.
And as it was then, it is still now.
So it is now.
Yes, it is. We're using Christianity to confirm what we've already made up in our mind is the correct political thing to believe in. Cherry pick things and say, well, this is how Jesus would do it. And that's probably not the case. Either Jesus didn't give a shit or you're actually contrary to what Jesus is actually preaching. Okay, the next chapter is an interesting one. Psychoanalysis in Christianity.
Yes.
We don't need to spend much time on it. It's a very interesting chapter. We don't need to spend much time on it. He opens up the chapter by talking about Freud and Jung. I do recommend anybody who likes to read a lot, I would delve into Freud and Jung. I prefer Jung over Freud. He takes a few pot shots at Freud because I think Freud got outside of from. I don't know. I only know Freud from his psychoanalysis, but from what I could gather from Lewis, it sounds like he started talking. Freud thought he was a linguist or something as well.
When Freud was, well, I mean, and when Lewis was growing up, Freud was the dominant.
Oh yeah,
psychologist.
Well, I think he's remained. I mean, Jung's had kind of a comeback in the last 20 years, not because of Peterson.
Well, and Freud is now considered more of a quack.
Right.
There's still to this day, Freud is still considered the lead on a lot of the things that he theorized about the subconscious, not necessarily based upon brain function. So
right.
Like if you're a neuropsychologist, you're like, no.
Right. Yeah.
You're like, we know waves and those types of things now. I'm aware of that, but more what he's talking about was talking about dream states, talking about the social aspect of the id, the ego, the superego, or the alter ego, kind of stuff. So, take a class on psychology before you dive into those two, please. So that way you can understand kind of where psychology has gone from them. Because out of all the things that are not, like, there's a lot of things that are not dated in this book, but for psychology at that point, it's fairly dated now. It is,
but I will say Jung has proven to be much more.
Yes.
He's held on much longer. Okay, so the bullet points on psychoanalysis are, because remember, when he's writing this again in the mid-50s, going to a psychiatrist was a new thing.
Yeah.
If you ever watch the show Mad Men, they talk about, it's dealt with in a season where basically main character is sending his wife off to go see a psychiatrist all the time because she's not fulfilled at home and it's all in your head, blah, blah, blah. So psychiatry is taking on at this time. I think there's just some general skepticism within the culture at large. And of course, within Christianity, there was a lot of skepticism that this is, you're relying on some sort of man-made secular thing and it's getting in the way of your faith. So he says, one, nope, not true.
Yeah.
He specifically says, one, no, that's not true. Christianity is okay with it. There's nothing wrong with it. And two, makes it clear to those reading this in the chapter, psychological issues are basically like any other disease. It's not literally saying they're a disease, but it's like any other disease you might have. You need to go see a doctor to treat them, And to have psychological issues, whatever they are, is not being sinful.
Right.
Again, he's being very specific to the church and what the church is going through. However, as we have said, again, when we've talked about the church and psychological stuff as well, the church really didn't get over that until very recently, I would say, depending on what denomination or something you belong to. But there are large swaths, particularly within the evangelical church, that just look skeptical and is like, no, you just need to pray more, or, you know, you need to talk to your pastor, or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, again, mid-50s, Lewis is like, no, not true. So, then he moves on to sexual morality. It's a big chapter. Again, I'm not going to spend much time on it, because in some ways he goes into it in detail. He has to, because as we've talked about, along with everything else, postmodernism, this is the beginning of the sexual revolution. Sexual revolution doesn't begin in the 60s. It begins in the 50s.
Yeah.
It begins basically when everybody comes home from either World War II or Korean War. The sexual revolution starts because everyone's really wanting to get on with life and make babies.
Hence baby boomers.
Yes. And so he first starts off by saying, contrary to what the sexual revolution is telling you, this isn't some meaningless thing. It's not meaningless to just have sex with whoever you want. There are consequences. There are rules. There are guidelines. There are proper ways to go about having sex, and there are improper ways of having sex.
Yeah, that's the... Yeah. I don't know. I always feel weird about this topic because I don't know if I can really speak to it very well.
Because you were promiscuous?
I wasn't. No, I feel like that's what makes it difficult.
Yeah, no, I understand.
It's just somebody to sit there and acknowledge that there are...
Neither was I, so we got two people who can't talk about it, so...
Well, I mean, here's...
But he speaks to that as well.
The hard part is sitting there and yes, he does, is acknowledging that, hey, there's... I was not. Me and my wife were high school sweethearts. We were virgins until we were married. And that was important to us. I'm also an advocate now to where I'm saying, like, because for us, it was never something that we ever wanted to give up. That was what I believe the correct mindset, where it was like, but yet I know so many people that held on to it as far as like this guilt and the shame thing,
right?
And it was like, nah, you missed the point. Like, if that's what you're holding on to it for, then you might as well get rid of it. And I know that seems weird, but no, like, I kid you not. That's not good either.
No. That leads to people, male and a female, going to Christian college, getting married because they just want to have sex and not do it, breaking God's law, but they're not really meant for each other.
Right. I'm not doing it because mom and dad told me to. That's what you're doing right there. Not because you're not curious, not because you don't want. And I mean, like, if you want to translate this to something else, like, let's talk about it in the context of, I was like, so that way it's less taboo for some people because people get weirded out. I was like, okay, then let's do it with alcohol, for example. Consumption of alcohol underage in the United States. This isn't a biblical law, but yet it's a law in our country in which we say that. And in the Bible, it says that you need to follow the law of the land. And so...
Well, he also said earlier, temperance is a big deal. So a lot of kids went out and got hammered on a weekend on a regular basis, but never had sex because They were scared to death of the latter, but not the former.
Right. And so it's like, so what is it that makes that? And we can sit there and we can say there's negative consequences, blah, 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 blah. The risk is just not. But seriously, especially when we're talking about the first topic, which we talked about, which is the sexual aspect, this is something that means a lot more to teens, and it weighs much more highly on their psyche. And so if we acknowledge that, understanding that and even to this day, and this is something that we acknowledge, is why is it if you found out that a man had gone out and if there was a man out there in the world that went out and he murdered 50 men, or there was a man who went out there and raped 50 women, odds are people would sit there and they would say that the man who raped 50 women is deserving of death more than the man who killed 50 men. And that's just how much we value that purity, that very intimate space of what sex is. You cannot deny that in our world, to sit there and say that isn't something that is intimate. And so when you sit there and you share that intimacy with multiple people, there are going to be problems that are created by that. There are going to be problems in your own marriage or your permanent status or whatever with another person, of inadequacy, of fear and resentment. If you have issues with exes, those types of things arise because of that intimacy that they once shared together. Because that is the closest that you could possibly get with another human being, is experiencing that intimacy at that particular level. And so you can't, I don't think that it's an argument, in my opinion, to sit there and say that if, you can just walk away from that and not have any side effects. Tim just walked away right when I finished, so I don't know what he's doing.
Sorry, this is quite a messy episode. I heard a commotion in the background, and apparently our puppy Tank is a toker, because I went in there and he had a bag of Doritos that he was munching down on. So
I was like, Tim just got up and left. Oh, yeah. And here he is.
Because he's mad because we took away his munchies.
You even smell like you got nacho cheese breath over there, bud.
How you doing there, Tank? Yeah, he spends some time on sexual morality, making it clear it's not something to take lightly.
No.
He takes a paragraph talking about how you might have to ask God to help you remain chaste, blah, blah, blah. But then he stops, because again, he's countering, I think, what a lot of what is going on in the church, and says, he says it's not the thing, though, that we need to be fixated on. And this is the part I'm going to read tonight. He says, finally, though I have had time to speak at some length about sex, I want to make it as clear as I possibly can that the center of Christian morality is not here. If anyone thinks that Christians regard unchastity as the supreme vice, he is quite wrong. The sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least of all sins. All the worst pleasures are purely spiritual. The pleasure of putting other people in the wrong, of bossing and patronizing and spoiling sport and backbiting, the pleasure of power, of hatred. For there are two things inside me competing within the human self, which I must try to become. They are the animal self and the diabolical self. The diabolical self is the worst of the two. That is why a cold, self-righteous prig who goes on regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute, but of course, it is better to be neither.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at when I said, if you're sitting there and you're holding on to this idea that, If you're sitting there and just like, I can't do it because somebody else is telling me this or that. Again, don't, like, that's not a reason to hold on to it. If that's the only reason that you've got, then that's not worth holding on to it for. Because again, very similar to what Lewis said, like that's a minor problem. I mean, like that's going to cause you headaches later on down the road. Like, like what I had just talked about, there are obvious things. It's not something that can't be circumnavigated, and not something that necessarily just because your hormones are raging or whatever. It's not something that you cannot come back from, or that won't take serious adjustment of the heart to come back from, in my opinion, and on C.S. Lewis's opinion as well. So I don't know. That's the hard part of that. But it is such a huge focus. I remember there's and probably those of you that have listened to this have heard of what is called True Love Waits. There was a staff member on the church that we used to go to, staff, who, when I was a sophomore in high school, they were upset over the fact that I was not participating in True Love Waits.
Okay.
And I was like, what? And I was helping with True Love Waits. It was put on by our youth ministry. I was helped setting up for the weekend, doing all that kind of stuff, making sure everything was going well. And this particular person was very upset over the fact that I wasn't participating. And I was like, I've already made this commitment. Like, I don't know why I need to take a seminar and get a ring to do this. Like, this is just not something that I want in my life for myself.
Yeah.
And that's the hard part, is that there becomes this pressure around this ring. There becomes this pressure around the commitment that you made. But if you didn't make it with your decision, then that causes problems. It's the same thing that I feel like we force, and this happens with a lot of different issues in Christianity, but I think another one is baptism, where it is we sit there and we force this baptism on them, where kids are just not mentally equipped at that point to be able to make that sort of decision. And so later on down the life, they want to get rebaptized, or they don't want to have anything to do with the faith because they're like, I was not ready for that. I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't get what that means for me. And so there are problems that arise through that, but I don't know.
Yeah, that's the eternal struggle of living in a Christian household. If you're a Christian parent, you have to understand, and I don't think most Christian parents think about this. It's not a criticism. We don't. A lot of us don't really have the time, or just, we're not sitting around contemplating deep things all the time. I think it's something that should be pointed out by youth pastors to parents, which is, when your kid is living in your house, or even maybe a few years outside of living in your house, to be perfectly honest, the Christianity that they are living out is your Christianity. It is not theirs.
Yeah.
And at some point, that kid's got to decide whether or not they buy into that thing that they have, that's been a household religion. And some kids, it's seamless. They've bought into it. Whatever they bought into when they were 14 and fully understood it, they've continued it. They stay on that path. They stay within the faith. They stay within the way, as the early church called it. You laugh, but I think that we should talk about that more. The way, it's because it means what it is. It's a direction we're going. It's not just this decision we make.
Sure.
But for a lot of kids, and I would include myself, because it's not because my parents were forcing my religion down my throat, or that the fact that all my for my grandparents were Pentecostal preachers. It's just at some point you have to decide, no, this is really what I believe in. It's not just some inherited family belief.
Yeah.
Then this shouldn't be complicated. Most of us grow up in a household of, we're Democrat in this house, or we're Republican in this house. And your parents expect you to be Republican or Democrat. And then when you come home and you say, no, I voted for Obama, it says, well, you're not over my dead body. It's no different.
No,
At some point, the kids have to decide, I believe in this thing, and you have to hope that you've done enough to mimic things in the right way. And sometimes you can do everything right, and the child just decides not to. And sometimes you can do a really shitty job mimicking Christianity, and you're responsible for them not following in the faith. So that's each individual situation. But keep that in mind. It is not just because kids grow up in a Christian home doesn't mean that they're going to, at some point, they have to believe and buy into this thing, which Lewis speaks about.
Yeah.
He speaks, we kind of glossed over it earlier in the book, but earlier in the book, he talks about faith is basically it's a fair balance of, I have a reasonable, rational amount of information to believe in Christianity, to where it's not just kooky talk.
Yeah.
But there's also just a healthy amount of faith, like a lot of things in life.
Right.
Okay. Next part he goes to is marriage. I'm going to skip past marriage. If you're listening to this, oh no, I'd really like to read the book. Sorry. Next one is forgiveness. Again, very big, very important chapter. He hits forgiveness right out of the gate. Says this is the hardest of the virtues.
Yeah.
We're really bad about this. No one listening to this should be surprised. He says something interesting. A couple paragraphs in, he said, before I was a believer, I used to hear, hate the sin, not the sinner. I think he even says even after he became a believer, he would hear that, and he always thought it was poppycock. And then he came to understand, no, actually, there's nothing, that's literally what we do.
Yeah.
He says it sounds silly for someone to say, no, I really love you, but you're a sinner. When we say, well, that's just a cop-out. But he says, no, actually, it's not a cop-out because that's how you judge yourself.
Right.
Now, that's the way he said. Look, Lewis speaks in extremes. And if you're reading this and you're thinking of exceptions, don't use that against Lewis. Lewis is always dealing with the extremes or the majority of things. Because when I read that, I thought, well, there's people who loathe themselves as being sinners, but those are the people you have to really worry about. Those are the people who turn into sociopaths and all that kind of thing, because like we talked about with Judas, unfortunately they become so obsessed with the fact that they are so horrible that they are irredeemable. Those people you have to worry about. So if anything, it's only justifying and substantiating what Lewis is saying. The healthy thing is to say, yeah, I sin, I mess up all the time. I don't mean to. I don't know why I do, but I still love myself. I don't find myself loathsome.
Right. I think that when we sit there and say the hard part, in my opinion, is, and I think Tim did a good disclaimer here, is, but going back to that whole idea of we hate the sinner. We do. We sit there and we hate people that sin.
Because we call them hypocrites.
Sure.
We fall in love with this word hypocrite. Somehow we're all sinners, but anytime someone points something out and they do the same, they're hypocrites. So we're just supposed to ignore them.
And we've talked about this on the show before, right? We looked at the situation with the hockey player.
Yeah.
We looked at it. We looked at James Gunn, for example. We've looked at these people and we sit there and we say, that's it. You're out. You've sinned. We've played judge, jury, and executioner, at least socially, for people that have done things on the public stage. Right, but it's not about let's get this guy some support and let's help them grow and develop and understand that that's not okay. No, it's let's drop them immediately because we can't handle the fallout that comes from it. Right? Like, that's not what it is. Right? No university that has dropped people because of racist comments that they have posted on whatever is not sitting there and saying, let's give them a training.
Right.
Let's help them grow and understand that that's not okay. No, that doesn't exist. It doesn't.
Well, in some instances, it's something from 5 years ago, and it's not even a question of have you grown since then without any training.
Right, no, and I mean, like, yeah, even then it's, we don't care about if you've grown, we just care that if you've done the incident, well, then you're out.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean, if you are listening to this and you feel like I'm not saying that that's not bad, that's not what I'm saying.
No, but, well, that's the next thing of what Lewis says, is forgiveness doesn't mean punishment. In some instances, we forgive, but we still have to punish.
Absolutely, that's not... And that's something that we've talked about on this as well, where I've talked about driving by the prison and, like, literally, like, crying over the fact that there are prisoners in there that are going to serve the rest of their lives there, and never see outside, and that's all they're ever going to know. And why that's upsetting is just that idea of... And never at once at any of that time did I sit there and say, well, those guys don't deserve that. That's not what's being said. I just feel sorrow for them in that the fact that they will never, because of some fucked up decision that they decided to make, or that life threw their way, that's all they're ever going to know is the inside of those prison walls. And that sucks ass. Because I know how beautiful life is. And that sucks. And it doesn't make what they did right. Like, it's just like, okay, well, we just don't do that to people. Nope, that's not it. But it doesn't mean that you can't feel sorrow and remorse for what happened there. And so, when people do fucked up things, it's okay that we have to adhere to the law, or you don't sit there and have consequences for their actions, to where you sit there and say, hey, I can't be friends with you anymore. That doesn't mean that you don't feel sorrow over the fact that you just lost a friendship because somebody just burned you. Mm-hmm. Where you sit there and you reflect and you're like, I remember those good times, but yet this just hurt too much. And to where I forgive you, I don't hold it against you. But at the end of the day, we can't do this anymore. And I think that's a very realistic expectation to have before you go into any of those things. So, I don't know.
All right. He wraps up the chapter. We won't go into too much detail. Wraps up the chapter by providing the distinction between thou shalt not murder, thou shalt kill. He provides, some of the language mix-ups, what the original language was.
Yeah.
And then he does mention he understands why people are pacifists, but believes they're mistaken, blah, blah, blah. So he's just kind of breaking down... I don't remember why that was in there, but... Okay. Next chapter, the great sin.
Are we only just on the great sin? Yeah, to split this into 2 parts.
So, great sin is, he alluded to this, we talked about this on the sexual sin. He says the great sin is not sexual morality, it's not some other things. It's contrary to what Christians believe. Pride is the greatest sin. That is the sin that God despises the most. And says it's the opposite of humility.
Why is that the greatest sin, Tim?
Well, he says it's because it's the greatest cause of misery for man, and the biggest cause of divide between man and God.
Yeah, what you're getting at here with pride is, again, you are now putting yourself at the level of God.
Before you continue.
Oh, sorry, you had just paused. So.
No, I know, I did, but just, I want to get this out of the way because he goes on and then he does the caveats, but I want to get the caveats out of the way. He makes it clear. Pride is not taking pleasure in being praised at doing something. That's not pride. Hey, you did a really good job. Oh, that's pride.
You can feel the pride from that, but no, that's not the pride. That's not.
You can also be proud of something that you did, just on your own without an attaboy. He's making it clear that's not in and of itself pride. Pride is bigger than that. Pride is I don't need God. Pride is I did this by myself without anybody helping me. Pride is I am better. Pride is going back to the sins. Pride is I am not that guy because I don't cheat on my wife, even though I cheat on my wife every day in my brain.
Right.
Pride is I am not a thief because I didn't rob the liquor store, but I've thought about stealing from my work.
Pride is I didn't pick the fruit and eat it. This woman gave it to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not being able to recognize fault.
We could probably spend 3 episodes just breaking this down and going through the Old Testament one thing after another, being pride is ultimately what is the downfall. Pride is the downfall of what we talked about on our Easter bonus episode of Judas. Judas took pride in he knew it was best. And what he thought was best was Jesus was going to be the savior of the Jewish people. And when he failed to do that, he sold him out because, well, Jesus isn't the guy. Because I know better.
Yeah.
Pride is the Tower of Babel. Pride is David and Bathsheba.
Right. I think it's a poison. Something that it's in every single person. Of just this idea of we think of ourselves as more than what we are. And
pride is the guy who's going to cast the first stone at the prostitute.
Those verses don't exist. We've already been over this time. Pride is... It's a difficult sin. It's one of the 7 deadly.
Well, he actually goes out his way to say, it is bigger than unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness. He says they are merely flea bites in comparison.
Yeah, it's the reason why, again, is just it is a poison. To where you take it and it infects you. And you can see it happen to people around you on a regular basis, to where there's somebody who's overly prideful, or you can see somebody who is just full of themselves. And that dictates the decisions that they make. But what's so hard is that it can happen to any single person at any given moment. And it can happen at a microscopic level where you sit there and just say, I just know better than this person, or I know better than this. And the decisions that you make have lasting consequences because of it. And it's tough. It's really, really tough. Pride is a tough sin. And yeah, I agree. I think it is one of those sins that is just it. Again, when we talked about earlier, when I said that Jesus is coming after the condition of the heart. Pride keeps him from being able to walk in. If you sit there and you know better, or you are better, or whatever, you are keeping from Jesus from coming into your life and being able to break down those walls and have a conversation with you. And so what you had said earlier was to break down that pride. When he says, like, hey, if this is something that you're doing, or if you think that you're better than this person, know that you're not.
Yeah, there's a great phrase, by the grace of God go I. And it basically means, like, that person might be doing X sin, but I'm doing Y and Z, and so I'm not going to be the one that casts a stone.
Right. I'm walking around with a fat ass blink in my eye.
Yeah. I mean,
and I'm not trying to remove the speck out of his eye. I'm just trying to help the guy out.
I mean, seriously, if we do look at most of the interactions, maybe all of the interactions Jesus has with antagonists in the New Testament, it is ultimately pride that he's dealing with. It's the pride of the Pharisees. It's, I know the Bible. This up and coming knucklehead kid thinks he knows the Bible better than I do. I'm going to ask him, what are the greatest sins? Jesus knows right away. It's because this guy thinks he knows the Bible, knows what we call the Old Testament better than he does. And he says, okay, well, I'll answer your question. It's actually, the scripture says this, but it also actually includes this and this and this.
Right.
And it does include, hey, there's this adulteress. What should we do? Because we're better than she is. And you're better than she is, so you better have the right answer. No, actually.
I wonder if the Pharisees ever thought that Jesus had, like... Never mind. I was going to say something, but I'm not going to... Yeah, I think that what Jesus is saying there is again, these are all humbling remarks for people to understand that, hey, we're all on the same playing field. He took the prideful Pharisees and put them at the same level as those that they had viewed as unworthy of God's affection and love.
Well, and pride is what gets, when the disciples get in trouble, it's pride.
Yeah.
I mean, the moment they get most chastised is the three that are arguing over who's going to sit on the right hand and the left hand and all that. Is you've missed the whole point. You've missed the whole point.
Right.
This isn't about glory when I set up this fictitious kingdom you think that's coming.
But also, that's what we're talking about when people sit there and say, I'm storing up treasures in heaven. Is you have done just as John and his brother did.
Yeah.
You know, John and James. You guys are sitting there and saying, so where do I get to be?
Right.
In this place?
And
Where's the royalty that I am bestowed because of how much work that I put in for this faith?
It's Peter's pride that calls Jesus to say, "Get behind me, Satan."
Yeah. Where Peter says that he is above the planning of a millenniums, to sit there and say, I will prevent that from happening. And he says, what Jesus said, and they don't put it in scriptures because they don't put curse words in scriptures, was what Jesus said was, get behind me, you dumb motherfucker who doesn't know anything. Because it was literally like, dude, Peter, you're missing the point. You've been missing the point the whole dang time, dude. Get with the picture. And so that's just very sad. Yeah. Again, Tim left, so...
All right, let's continue with this epic Spartacus episode of the Go to Hell podcast. All right, the next item he brings up is charity again.
Which we had talked about.
Well, we did, but in this chapter, he says, okay, I talked about charity before as being basically what everybody thinks of it is, as giving to the poor, but in a classical sense, for most of the history of church and Christendom, charity is a much bigger word, and basically the word means loving others.
Yes.
So there's a lot in the chapter. A lot of it's kind of redundant what you've already said, but one key point that he makes in that chapter is he points out, I think it's a fair point, is he says the difference between worldly people and Christians is that worldly people are basically nice to the people they like. They love the people they like, but they don't love their enemies. And Christians are called to, it's not that we do, but we are called to love our enemies.
Right.
And that is the difference. Next chapter is hope. Sorry, folks, I'm going to skip over hope. It's not that I don't think hope is important. I think it is very important, but just to keep moving along, we're gonna move on. We'll hit hope when we do our Shawshank Redemption episode.
Yes.
Okay, and then the last two chapters are both faith, and two different aspects of faith. So when he says faith is, I'm just gonna meld both chapters into one big discussion. I'm not gonna differentiate between the two chapters. So he points out that, I think as I said before, it's not just blind faith in something. There requires this moment where you reach a what's the word? You reach a point where there's enough, one might call, evidence to support that Jesus is who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And then there's also just further believing everything else. There's a event horizon where okay, it's not just I have blind faith that this guy was this carpenter and blah 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 blah. You read the scriptures. There was a good at church this Sunday. There was a good somebody had visited church on Easter, and they mentioned it in the service where someone said, I believed my whole life that Jesus didn't exist, and I showed up to your church on Easter, and you kind of persuaded me that this whole Jesus thing and rising from the dead actually happened. So I think that was a perfect encapsulation of what Lewis is talking about. Then he goes on to say, and then he transitions to where faith is more than just belief, that it's actually kind of a way of life. It's a practice.
Yes.
And the more we practice at it, the better we're going to be. So, if we do it 1 week, then 2 weeks is easier, and 3 weeks is easier, and then after a while, it's just a way of life. But basically makes it clear, time and practice is key to faith.
Yes.
He does throw in an interesting little nugget where he says, and I don't think I'm paraphrasing him incorrectly. He basically says, and I've talked about this. I think I've mentioned my father talked about this later a lot when I talked to my dad about issues of Christianity, where he says, the older I get, the more doubtful I actually get about things. And the way he describes it as, he describes it as a mood. There are moods in your life where you're having a harder time with Christianity than you might have in other periods, and that's okay. We go through these fits where it's a little harder than it was maybe. It doesn't get easier. I think the whole point of it is, just because you've been practicing as a Christian for 10 years doesn't mean the 10 to 20 years are going to be easier and the 20 to 30 years are going to be easier. You're going to go through periods where actually you're going to have a harder time with this.
Yeah.
And part of it's because, there's a level of idealism built into Christianity as to how people are going to live. And I think you kind of, even though it's childish to expect that you treat people nice, you're going to get treated nice back.
Yes.
You get shit on and you're just like, well, what's the point of this? And it's not sinful or being a doubting Thomas or anything to be like, well, what the fuck am I getting out of this thing if I'm still getting shit on?
Yeah.
And life's getting harder.
Yeah.
Again, I think that is where it's good to read your Old Testament, because people get really cranky with God and be like, dude, what the hell?
Yeah.
And God usually says, all right, you can ask me and you get mad at me. I'm a big boy. You're not going to like my answer, but I'm going to give you an answer.
You're really not.
But it's okay to get upset. And then he talks about, I already mentioned belief is not a blind faith in something. And then he talks a bit about, he makes a clear distinction. I think he's trying to make distinctions within the church or misconceptions within the church, where he says, this isn't simply being a follower of Jesus and me being able to do, he's now trying to work out the works and the faith part that is always the difficult part of being a Christian. I don't care if you're a Catholic or a Protestant. If you're a Protestant, you were told Jesus does all the work, and then you're like, okay, so does that mean I can do whatever the hell I want to do?
Yeah.
And if you're a Catholic, it's like, well, I have to do all this stuff, and it's like, well, I'm barely treading water here. Oh, where does the faith kick in? And he's trying to say it's neither one or the other.
Right.
You have to work at trying to be a better person. You have to work at doing the things that God calls us to do, that Jesus calls us to do, the things that society might say. I mean, frankly, what he talked about, the thing that we don't want to talk about right now in the church because society mocks us for it is, one needs to be sexually chaste and in some way.
Yeah.
We are called to do that, whether we understand it or not. Yeah. But doing those things is not what's going to save us. Ultimately, the more we try to do those things and fail, the more we realize I'm not doing this without God and Jesus helping me out.
Yeah.
He also takes a moment to point out, some of you are going to gradually struggle your entire life, and understand that. And I think he even points out Paul, and I think John Bunyan. And I don't know much about John Bunyan. I've read Pilgrim's. Did he write Pilgrim's Progress? Is that what he wrote?
He's actually Paul Bunyan's father.
He wrote one of the great Christian books of, I don't know which. Anyway, I think from what I could gather, they both had, one of those they had one of those aha moments.
Yes, he wrote The Pilgrim's Progress.
Yes. And he was apparently a prolific sinner before he became a Christian, had an aha moment similar to Paul, wrote arguably one of the greatest Christian works ever. And so, but he's saying, like, that's not most of us. Most of you are going to struggle, and that's fine. Doesn't make you any less of a Christian than Paul was or Bunyan. Again, he gets back to good actions or faith in Christ as being paramount to faith. And I think he makes a very good analogy to make it clear that it's not one or the other, but it's both. He says, trying to decide if it's actions or faith that is paramount to a Christian walk is like trying to decide which blade of a pair of scissors is more important.
Yes.
And I think that perfectly encapsulates that it's both simultaneously.
Right.
You cannot sit home and be like, I'm just going to do whatever and continue to live the way I did before I was a Jesus follower, not at all try to clean up, and yes, I'm going to drink too much one night, I'm going to swear, or whatever your thing is, or I'm going to be prideful when I shouldn't be prideful. But that doesn't mean I still don't try to work on those things and not be that, but also understand ultimately anything I do is not saving me. It is the saving grace of Jesus Christ dying in the blood he shed.
Right.
To further the point, he then, towards the end of the chapter and the book, picks on two parodies of the two sides of the church. And he says, one side of the church, being the Catholic Church, says, you're a sinner, give all your money to the church so the church can do great things, and that's going to save you. And the other extreme on the other side is, Jesus died for you, his blood saves you, and so you can do whatever the hell you want because you've been saved. And he said neither one of those extremes is accurate.
Right. Which I feel like you can deduce why that would be the case.
Right. And then he wraps up the chapter by saying this. And I think this is good for someone who at this time was still a relatively new Christian. And he's made it clear in this and other writings that he was put off by the works part of Christianity.
Yeah.
And he says, look, this is the way the Christian life's going to be. The Christian life is going to be seemingly about, at the beginning, all about morality and your duties and the things you're supposed to do and the things you aren't supposed to do. But if you live out that long enough, that life long enough, it's going to lead you to a much more enriching life that you don't even have to, it's just like natural, like swimming.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it is. Yeah, I don't even feel like there's anything left to be said on that.
No.
No, I think that is... It will be that natural. It's like riding a bicycle.
So is that it?
I think so.
For our
2 hour
2 hours and 20 minute episode, 2 hours and 21.
Well, I mean, we gotta like cut a couple of things out.
A couple of minutes. We'll be down to 2:15 maybe.
Yeah, I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to this episode of the Go to Hell podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review. It's those subscriptions that boost us up on Apple Podcast and Spotify, etc. If you like what you've heard here, great. If you don't, go to hell.
Cheers.